objective of having something on our calendars for every day so that we can keep learning about something that we're really passionate about. That's product management. And I'm thankful to them for initiating this and having me play a role. For those of you who don't know me, I am a recent MBA graduate from the Schulich School of Business, and prior to that, I was working as product manager in India in the digital media and automotive industry. Uh, the format for today is typical that we've had so far. We have 1 hour with a guest, and I'll start off the AMA by asking a couple of questions to our guest. And everyone attending the session is free to ask any question that you might have for our guest in the Zoom chat or the YouTube comments. And I'll pick up those questions every now and then and ask them to our guest. We are also recording this session, and we'll be posting the recording to YouTube shortly after the session. And to get in touch with us regarding feedback, any topic that you want to see on Product AMA, or any particular leader that you would want to invite to Product AMA, it's best to message us directly on Twitter or LinkedIn at Product AMA, or you can also reach out to myself, Mark, or Lee on LinkedIn. We'll be happy to consider any feedback that you might have. All right, let's get started. Our topic for today is entrepreneurship and digital transformation. And joining us today for that, we have Darby Sieben, who is the co-founder and head of Ampli, which is a cashback program app under RBC Ventures. Darby is a serial entrepreneur and an advisor, an investor, and a mentor to tons of companies. His experience has been so diverse that I will let him introduce himself to our audience. Darby, please go ahead and tell us about your journey, and also tell us one unknown fact about yourself.
Fair enough. Thanks for the invite. So my name is Darby Sieben. As Rhythem mentioned, I'm currently leading Ampli, which is a cashback program with RBC Ventures. Prior to joining RBC Ventures, I had the privilege of working with Yellow Pages Group. They acquired a company of mine back in 2005. And I joined Yellow Pages Group to help with their digital transformation as they were moving that company from a print-based company to obviously a digital first company. So during that time frame, with them for about 12 years, during that time frame, I had the opportunity to run our tech shop, really build out a lot of the digital products, at least the initial use cases of the digital products that YP would then scale. Managed our partnerships, ran our national agency for a couple of years, helped launch Walmart Media Group within the Canadian marketplace underneath that, and was involved in a number of different M&A acquisitions with YP. The company that they bought was actually an agency that we had built in Calgary. And that was an agency that was really aimed at helping traditional companies migrate to digital advertising and digital as a source of traffic. So what we really built at that time was products to help monitor, newspaper, radio, television, while we could then craft the story around how the internet fits within that mix. And going back a little bit farther into the 90s, my first company, we were building a JavaScript e-com platform. This was in the late 90s, a little bit ahead of its time. We were trying to, still get people to convince them that the internet was a thing that was actually going to become big before we could even start to talk about our product. But that was my first exit that I had in 1999, and I sold that company to an ISP that was based out of Calgary. So that's a little bit of my journey. Something that people may not know about me. So I've always kind of been an entrepreneur. My first business, it was back when I was probably around 12 or 13. I wanted a ghetto blaster, which for maybe the younger viewers, ghetto blaster, what's that? The old version of the iPod. Wanted a ghetto blaster, and I'm like, okay, how do I make that happen? That was kind of my first foray into making this happen. And I didn't really like the notion of delivering newspapers, although I did deliver newspapers. And I figured there had to be a better way to do it. And at that time, I was pretty good with DOS, and I was helping a lot of friends and family with how to use DOS 4.0 and all of these interesting things. So I decided to write a manual, and I published ads in newspapers at that time, and asked people to send me $10 to a PO box, and I would sell them my manual. And I sold enough to end up buying my Ghetto Blaster, and then I closed the business down because I got what I needed out of it. And that was kind of my first foray into, you know what, if you have something of value, people will probably buy it. So that's a tidbit that a lot of people don't know about me. That was my first business.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, and I mean, Darby, you're like doing so many things. How do you even manage your time? Even I think even I can use some advice there. How do you manage your time?
Yeah, you know, time management is always a big thing. That is always a common thing. I think the most important thing is really picking and choosing the things you don't want to focus on and you don't want to do, right? I mean, one thing that is the great equalizer is obviously time. And so, you know, really picking your battles on where you're going to spend time. And then second, where are you going to spend time that you're actually going to enjoy the most of? And so kind of two thoughts there: deprioritize stuff that just doesn't matter in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, say right now. And then second, you know, if there are things that need to get done, outsource the stuff you don't like to do to people that like to do that kind of stuff, so you can focus on the stuff you want to end up doing. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just really picking your battles. And when you do pick those battles, go really, really deep and focus 100% of your energy and efforts. I'm not a big fan of multitasking. I don't think multitasking is necessarily a good thing when you're trying in the thinking stage. But really just focus and deprioritize.
Awesome, awesome. That's a great outlook. All right, coming back to the topic, Darby, you've been in the industry for over 20 years now. How has the entrepreneurial and digital transformation landscape changed over these years?
Yeah, I think the big one is things are accelerating a lot faster now than I think they ever have. You know, we've seen, and this is a moment in time right now with COVID-19, where you know, digital acceleration has, you know, just stepped up to the next level. And it's kind of been nascent in the context of everybody knew they had to do this. But sometimes what happens is inertia sets in and things take time to move. But I think we're at that stage now where obviously the momentum has really, really come into play. So if I go back to, you know, when I started my first business in '97 to now, you can see how the conversation has gone from, well, why do we need this tool, you know, called the internet? Why do we need to do these things? To, okay, now we actually have to make it happen. And I think there's different stages and different companies at different moments in time. When I joined Yellow Pages Group in 2006, when they bought my company in '05, I joined them in 2006. You know, this was right at the peak of when our print business was still growing, very, very high margin. And we were lucky to have a CEO at that time that realized we needed to start to lean into digital, because we had this entity that was coming that was really massively disruptive in Google, who was going to, you know, damage and disrupt our business. And so at that time, you know, media was kind of one of the first segments that had to move really, really fast to shift, because, you know, there was kind of low hanging fruit. Now we're starting to hit a lot of the other industries where, you know, the acceleration of digital is just going to be starting to get baked in, but that just takes time. So it's definitely has sped up faster, you know, even in the last 5 years, and I would say the first, say, 15 of my career.
And now even faster with all the COVID situation. I see a lot of increase in the adoption for you know, technologies and especially like e-commerce payments on that front. So I think now even faster.
Absolutely, absolutely, it is, and I think there's also the recognition that because of this particular environment, I think there was a lot of pent up demand on things that were going to happen. And maybe without COVID, it could have happened over the next 1, 2, or 3 years, but things have been massively accelerated because of COVID.
Yeah, for sure. All right. This next question is about, since this is product AMA, so about product management. So I feel product management and entrepreneurship have a lot in common. What are your thoughts on the similarities and the differences between these two?
Yeah, that's a great question. From a similarity perspective, I think both entrepreneurship and product management is really about, again, prioritization. It's picking the battles, knowing which battles to pick at any given point in time, leveraging the insights that you're going to get from as you're building a company or even building a product. You're going to make more mistakes at the beginning than which is just natural. But it's really about prioritizing, understanding what the data is quote unquote telling you, and then pivoting very quickly. And so, as I often say, don't necessarily fall in love with the idea, but fall in love with the outcome, and then give yourself that full permission to change and shift and move and do what you need to do on that particular front. I actually think there's a lot of similarities between the two. There's obviously risk profiles that are related to both. I think one of the biggest differences is if I just narrow down specifically to product development, typically that's going to happen, let's say, within a larger organization, unless you're an entrepreneur building a product. And if you're doing the two, well, then they're very much interconnected. I do think entrepreneurs maybe take more risk, especially if they're fronting their own capital into it, or their own time. Even if it's not their own capital, there's still the time element. But ultimately, I think there's so many overlapping similarities. It's kind of hard to say what's exactly the difference. I think the bigger structure is whether you're maybe an entrepreneur who's coming out directly building a company. So you're going to have to deal with HR, legal, finance, product development, et cetera, to an intrapreneur where you're building solutions inside of a large organization where some of those components that might be required from building a company are already done. Legal structure's already there, finance structure's already there, and now you're much more focused on innovating within an environment as opposed to building. But both are fun, actually.
Absolutely. And interesting. I mean, just to add to the similarities, I think to those of us who have read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, it's also about, how do you test your hypothesis quickly, get that data, and then iterate on that. So I think both product managers and entrepreneurs are striving to do that and learn more about their customers. So I think that's another similarity that I see between the two worlds. A follow-up question on that. This is an audience question by Lee. It's often said that founders and entrepreneurs are the de facto first product managers of their companies. How have you handled this in your ventures, and when has it been necessary to dedicate a full-time person to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if I think of the notion of a founder within whether it's a founder inside of a company or a founder outside, fully building up, I think that analogy at the beginning, that founders, are the natural product people. They're identifying the solution in terms of what they want. I think as the business starts to scale, you start to look at what are those skill sets that are required to surround yourself with the right level of talent in order to execute. And so that for me becomes really a question of how do you take what your skills are and amplify those. And because you've got this limited time set that exists within the market, you're going to be, or just the 24 hours a day that we all have. How do you then start to think about and say, okay, when do you bring those like-minded individuals in that share that same passion for the problem you're trying to solve, who might be looking at very different things. And so, that's going to vary really based on where you're at within the business cycle, where you're at within the product development cycle, et cetera. But ultimately, I would argue that a well-run team at the beginning, you may have a dedicated product manager who's responsible for delivering features or what have you. But ultimately, it's the entire organization that are product people, right? They all have to be bought into the solution that you're doing, and then you're going to have expertise around. Okay, if you're doing a mobile application, you're really going to want somebody that's going to understand whatever React Native or iOS or Android specific development or what have you. So that would be my view on that.
Awesome. Shifting gears a little bit, another question that I have is a very important attribute of entrepreneurs and digital transformation leaders is awareness, being aware of the trends and what is happening in the industry right now. How do you make yourself aware and stay on top of these trends? And how has that helped you during your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I frame the discussion around trends, and a lot of what I do is candidly just read and observe what's happening out there. So I spend a lot of time reading, trade journals and future predictions and books and what have you. My mental model, as I think about staying on top of trends, is actually trying to find the things that don't change. And so there are certain kind of absolutes that exist. And I'll just use an example right now of Ampli. And you could say, well, we're a cashback app, and there's different ways that we go about doing it and what have you. But fundamentally, the problem we're trying to solve is a universal problem. On one end, we've got users that want to extract as much value out of what they do, right, which is a kind of a common theme. And on the other side of the equation, you have merchants who are trying to acquire users at the lowest price point that you could possibly get. And so when I think about, Ampli, or I think about Google, or I think about, Amazon's product search, or heck, even Netflix, a lot of those problems really boil down to the intersection of 2 points and trying to find out how do you do that really, really efficiently. And so if I understand what doesn't change, then I look at the marketplace and say, okay, with the new emerging technologies that are happening, with the emerging ways that we might be doing stuff, or even things that can happen from a geopolitical perspective, let's just narrow it down to, some of the big macro trends in terms of, okay, broadband internet. When I started in this journey, I was dealing with 300 baud modems. Broadband internet, unleashed a whole set of businesses that couldn't exist before that. The iPhone created businesses that couldn't exist before that. But I would argue that most of the problems are still exactly the same problems. They just manifest themselves differently. So when I look at new trends, I look at it from the context of how do we apply that on top of the things that don't change? And is there an opportunity there to create more value?
Interesting. We have some questions flowing in from the audience. This is more on the lines of setting objectives and tracking them. So Kais, if I pronounce it correctly, he's asking about how do you approach setting useful results or KPIs in relation to the objectives that you set?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's one thing with metrics and data and numbers. There's a lot of it that exists out there, arguably with any business. And I think sometimes really deeply thinking through what are those metrics that really matter. And so a tactic that I've used in my career and that I use with my teams are, you can't have equal, if you rank numbers from 1 to 10, you can't have 2 number ones and you can't have 2 number twos. So force rank the conversation between 1 and 10. Force ranking, I find, actually does help, because what it does is it gives you that ability to debate whether or not something is first or second. Now, the one in second place might just be a shy underneath, say, the most important metric on the first one. But I do find force ranking actually helps one really think through what is the most important thing. I think the other side of it is, at any given point in time, depending on what your next objective is, your metrics are going to change. right? And so the exercise of, understanding what are those global metrics that typically will not change within the business, to what are those quarterly or monthly objectives that may change based on what you're trying to do. But I find force ranking helps a lot, because it forces you to say, is that one the most important, or the second most important, or the third most important?
Interesting. And talking about objectives, it's very important to keep the teams aligned as well. So another question from the audience is it's ideal for everyone in the company to be part of the product team, but what are the most effective ways that you have found to keep everyone aligned, especially when things are changing fast?
Yeah, on that front, it is the most important job of a founder or a leader, whether it's for the entire business or whether it's in a functional unit, is really establishing that cadence of communication. Be consistent, and be very, very clear, and transparent around how things may or may not change. So, what I can usually tell my teams are, the one constant that will change is going to be change. Like, that's just going to simply happen. But I think sometimes you've got to measure between moving very, very fast around some of the core KPIs. And so I think of these global KPIs where you can really start to anchor a lot of discussions into. So these are the big 2, 3, 4 product KPIs that simply are not going to change. And you can look at a few of those things, right? You can look at Google's model since the beginning that they launched. The click-through rate off of a query is a very lead indicator to both, relevancy for a user as well as a lead indicator to revenue model. And so that's kind of been a global metric that they've been anchored in a while. And so, being very clear on what we're trying to do at a high level, working with the organizations to establish their KPIs as they roll up into that. Be very, very consistent with the communication. Over communicate if you have to. I think selling the vision is always important in terms of where we plan to take this thing and where we end up, where we want to end up going, are important pieces to to managing the teams. I think the second thing that I work with my teams on is getting them to answer the question, when you wake up on Monday morning and your first 30 minutes when you're working, how do you know you won last week or you didn't win last week? Because if your organization can say, we won last week, I can guarantee you're moving the ball forward. And so, one tactic that I've used in my career is really forcing teams to have that lens of what does that Monday morning look like, and did I win or lose last week? And getting them to define what that means, anchored into. I find that most individuals, once you're very clear on your vision, once you're very clear on the global metrics, they're going to naturally figure out how they can best contribute to those members. Sometimes you got to help them with that, and that's totally cool. But I do find that anchoring questions are a really, really good one.
Awesome. That's great. Shifting gears a little bit again, and focusing more on Ampli. So you recently celebrated the 1-year anniversary of Ampli, and congratulations on that, by the way. With regards to Ampli and other ventures that you have had in the past, how has product development and management different for the companies in an early stage versus when you are in the growing stage, for example, with Ampli right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's as the businesses grow, and you get larger, there are different time cycles within the business. So Ampli is celebrated, as you said, it's 1-year anniversary in terms of being live and in public. But we're kind of 2 years into this build. And so, I would say at those really, really early stages, as you're now figuring out, the proof of concept and you're starting to build out the product, you want to really, have the people around you that are okay with the delayed gratification of the work that you do, right? And so it's okay, we're building, and sometimes that can be hard, right? Especially if it takes a while to build out your product line, because there's a natural immediate response when you put something live that just gets certain individuals really riled up. So there's kind of that pre-build phase where it's like, okay, we've got to really crisply define what it is we're trying to do and iterate quickly and what have you. Then there's this kind of phase that we're in now with Ampli, where for the most part the product is proven. We've got all the right proof cases or use cases that we need to understand that the product can work. Now it's just a matter of scaling up, and so you're moving into a very different growth mode model, where it might actually be a little bit less about the product per se, and you're kind of moving and shifting much more into, say, the marketing angle of it. And then as the business starts to mature, you're going to end up becoming a more of an industrialized machine. So as the user base grows, as the revenue grows, a lot of the components of, say, looseness that you might have at the beginning as you're moving very quickly and breaking eggs, now it's becoming a real business. And so now you've got obligations. You've got obligations to your customers. You've got obligations for your suppliers or whatever that might end up being. And you go through those different journeys. There are people that some are happy to go through all of those, and then there are times where now you've got to make some of the changes because you're moving to a different phase of the company. And so I kind of liken it to a child, right? You have a baby, and now it's a baby. It can't do anything on its own. You got to feed it. You got to do this. You got to do that. And then eventually they start walking, and eventually they start talking, and then all of a sudden, they're going outside and playing with their friends for hours on end, and then they're teenagers, and they're getting married, and then they're becoming this. And so if I think of businesses, it's almost like the evolution of the way we go as people, right? From babies to eventually, not being here, and not saying companies, but companies do evolve that way as well.
Awesome. Just as a reminder to our audience, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have for Darby in the Zoom chat. We've got some great questions coming in, and please continue to flow your questions in. There's another question that I've got from the audience, which is about what has been happening recently under quarantine with the corona situation. Is there anything that you've learned in the past few months under lockdown about your teams that has impacted your personal perspective as a leader?
Yes. I would say the one thing that I'm probably more aware of and more cognizant of with this environment is really understanding and working with your team and giving them the safe zone to talk about some of the challenges. It's just the interpersonal challenges, that can exist in this type of environment. And so, you've got one side where we've got team members that have, children at home. And so you've got to manage that environment. On the other side of it, we have team members that, are young, single, live, downtown Toronto. And that's actually very hard as well, because their entire, life has kind of been disrupted as well. And so I think, for the most part, everybody on my team has been amazing with responding really well to working from home, leveraging the tools that we have, stepping up the communication. But I think as leaders, we have to be really cognizant of the mental health side of this and not diminish that, especially in an environment like this, because, now, in an office environment, it gives everybody a little bit of break sometimes of what might be happening within a home environment. In this environment, they're all kind of combined together. And so I think as leaders, we have to be really aware of that and give space to your teams when they need the space. Work with them on giving them the tools to help, understand how to work within this kind of an environment if naturally, they like the office environment. And try to do things as much as normal as you possibly can. But from my perspective, I would say the heightened awareness around the mental health impacts, and that's always been important for me. But I think COVID has really brought that up much higher. And I think I'm a better leader for it because you're more in tune with what your teams are feeling and how this is impacting them.
All right. Yeah, for sure. Like I was talking to some other leaders in Toronto, as well as looking at LinkedIn. Some of the companies down south, especially in the Silicon Valley, they're giving time off to their employees because one of the things that they have observed is now, since people are working from home, they're spending more time on work than they usually do when they're in office. So that's really important, and I think mental health is really important in that aspect. Uh, we have another question here from the audience. So Kevin is asking that what are some ways to look at building partnerships to help with user acquisition, but particularly if you are strapped for resources such as cash or a big network?
Yeah. And that's I would argue that any size of organization probably has those same limitations. Sometimes cash can be nicer. You can just kind of buy your way into it. I think the basis of any partnership, whether you're a large company or whether you're a small company, comes down to the value equation that you're bringing to the table. And so, money is one factor to partnerships, and there's some of them where it's like, hey, you just got to pay to play to get in there. But I think if you're really, really thoughtful around, okay, these are what we're bringing to the table, this is what we're asking, and you're really thoughtful around the value creation, and you're thoughtful around the execution of that, because there is a second side of this. It might make sense on paper, but maybe for whatever reasons, logistically, it becomes very, very difficult. But I think it's all anchored in value. And if it's anchored in value, I think, both sides of it can see that. Then it just becomes a question of, okay, can we just logistically make it happen? Is the timing right? Sometimes timing can just be off, even though it's a great idea. And so if you're new and you're starting out, you're going to have to really, really lean heavily on value as the differentiator. If you're a bigger company, you can lean on the fact that you've got capital, right? And then you can kind of buy your way into it. But ultimately, even if you buy your way into it, there still has to be a value creation. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a fairly short-lived partnership. So spending a lot of time thinking about that, and it's not just what they can do for you. I would argue successful partnerships is probably spending the majority of your time on what can I do for them and understanding their ecosystem, or what have you, and then backing it into what you would be expecting from them.
Awesome, interesting. Uh, Talking about, we earlier we spoke a lot about prioritization, be it in our personal lives or when it comes to being product managers or entrepreneurs. Uh, you know, Talking about digital transformation as well, like when starting up, entrepreneurs might have an array of opportunities ahead of themselves. How does prioritization work in that case? Maybe you can share a couple of examples as to you saw a lot of opportunities where products or companies could head in the direction of, and you had to prioritize. So how does that process work? Some examples from your career might be helpful to understand that better.
Yeah, I think it's when it comes to prioritization, there's no right or wrong. It's just a choice around A or B or what have you. I think one of the things that I would say for starting entrepreneurs is as you're opining on the concept that you're starting to think about, and you're starting to figure out, okay, does this actually make sense? Engage in a lot of conversations. Whether that's people within your industry or people without your industry, and just talk about the ideas as you're thinking about those. Obviously, in the back end, you want to be understanding a little bit around size of market and the normal stuff that you would do as you're kind of launching something on that front. Again, for me personally, I've always anchored most of my decisions around kind of what hasn't changed. And most of the say the businesses that I invest in, or a lot of the companies that we talk about, it's the product owners have a great concept and they well thought through the problem they're trying to solve, right? And I think you've got to be very clear on the articulation of that problem. So I've seen pitch decks that are, 100 different ideas on a slide. And it's like, wait a minute, I don't know what you're trying to do. And if you're trying to boil the ocean, it's probably not going to work. If you're really, really crisp with the problem you're trying to solve, why that actually matters, why people will actually care about that. I think getting really, really crisp is important. It allows you to get out, start having those conversations, get the feedback, do what you need to do, and then just be open to pivoting. So I don't know if I have a magic formula for prioritization, but I would say less is probably more at the beginning, and don't try to boil the ocean. The worst pitch decks I've seen are the ones that try to solve 100 different problems. It just doesn't work.
Sure. I think with being crisp and concise is also the fact that you're focused is also very important, especially when you're starting up. So focus on for whom are you trying to solve this problem, and whom are you targeting. That's great. And just a follow-up question there. You initially mentioned about, it's about choice. Prioritization is about choice. And I think when it comes to choice, there are two things that come to mind. You have your data, all the quantitative and qualitative data that you have, and then comes your instinct. What has been, your experience there as to working with data versus working with your gut?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me personally, it's both. I would say gut calls are actually anchored in data, just in the context of just reading and understanding as much as you possibly can about industries and things that are there. So I absorb a lot of information that way, and I think sometimes what can end up happening, I don't know what the right medical word is for this, but as you read information, as you do all of this stuff does resonate sometimes in your head. And what my gut will usually tell me is, it's like, wait a minute, you kind of want to go in this direction. And it's telling me to go in this direction, probably because I already have the data sitting somewhere in my head that I've read in the past. I just can't necessarily articulate it that way. So, following your gut is not necessarily a bad thing. If you've, really invested in kind of the problem that you're trying to solve, because I find in most cases your gut is probably right, rooted in some good data and facts and understanding peripheral businesses and what have you. I think one of the cautions that I often give is, and I'm a very data driven individual, is you do have to find that right balance, because sometimes if you ask individuals what they want and what they actually do may be two different things. And so as much as, you want to challenge somebody who is making a gut decision, like why, it's a great question. Keep asking why, eventually you'll get to the answer. You also want to challenge individuals that are highly, highly just pure data driven as well. Because in some cases, you would get a false positive. I think the classic example is if you had asked people in 2004 if they wanted an iPhone the way it's constructed today, nobody would have been able to answer that question. They would have been completely wrong, because it just didn't exist in their head. But the problem of having 1,000 songs in your pocket, that's actually an interesting problem, right? And so the manifestation of that just happened to be, say, an iPod. So that's kind of the way that I think about the whole gut data conversation. They go hand in hand. But if you're passionate about what you do, you're a deep study in terms of what you are, likely your gut is probably going to be the right thing, because you've already absorbed the information, just may not come out exactly. I don't know, subconscious.
Yeah. So it's all about, like Steve Jobs mentioned, it's all about connecting the dots, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It very much is. I mean, I would say the one thing that I do really, really well is that ability to see a lot of data. I can absorb a lot, and it's just finding those pieces and those connections, and again anchored into very simple problems that we're trying to solve on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and Lee here has a great comment in the chat that gut instinct is equal to pattern recognition. How well
100%.
you can do that, and 100%. Awesome. Moving on. Darby, what have been your most significant learnings in your career, and what advice would you give to your younger self if you were just starting off your career?
Yeah. When you sent me those questions, I was thinking about that one. Um, I think there's a couple. First one is, and I mentioned it earlier. Fall in love with the results. Don't necessarily fall in love with the idea. And I've been guilty of that at the beginning. Hey, it's my idea, it's my company. This is what I want to do. This is how I'm thinking about it. And you tend to fall in love with the concept, sometimes not necessarily the results of it. And so I would say, in my earlier days, still learning this today, so I'm not by any stretch an expert on it, but I've made a lot of mistakes. So there's a few I can avoid now. Is really just that notion of just pivoting very, very quickly and probably listening more than you're actually speaking about what you're doing. So I think as young individuals, we like to talk a lot. I think listening is pretty important on that front. So I mean, those are a couple of pieces of advice I would give my younger self. I think the other one is also just be careful and never judge who you come across. The one thing that's fascinated me in my career is, every connection that I've made, be very respectful, try to understand. You just never know what's going to happen. You could be building the best company, the best product. It ultimately does come down to people. It was some advice when I moved to Calgary in the early 90s. I got a piece of advice that said, don't judge anybody when you start talking to them or you meet them, because you could be talking to somebody who's a multimillionaire and have no idea. And the first investor in my company was actually found that way. I was, sitting at a bar, waiting for my friend to get off work. We started to have a conversation. 45 minutes in, my friend was late coming out. 45 minutes in, turns out, this gentleman happened to be, a head geologist for Petro-Canada at the time, and loved the passion of what we were trying to do. And on, this was on a Thursday, and on a Monday we went and got the check in order to make that happen. And so never judge a book by its cover, because you never know who you're talking to, and listen more than you talk.
Of course, very rightly said. And talk about launching careers. What kinds of opportunities are there, at accelerators or incubators, ventures, for talented people that need to gain experience in product management to launch their careers?
Yeah, I think there's a lot out there. I think, we are in a pretty exciting time when you think about the number of companies, the number of industries that are all looking for really good, solid talent. And, when I say that, I think it has to be anchored individually in what your passion is. And so some people, have a passion for media. Some people have a passion for transportation. Some people have a passion for healthcare. And I think that's important because I think if you can anchor what's that thing that gets you really, really excited waking up every single day, then it moves away from I'm trying to go out to get a job to I'm just really, really, really passionate about this concept. And I think that comes through. And I would say in an early on, be vocal, even if you don't have a lot of experience on this. I think we've got a lot of tools out there today that you can build your own personal brand around. Here are the things that interest me, and here's observations, and becoming part of the conversation. And if you go to my blog as an example, you'll see, when I had my previous company from like 2002 or 2003, because it's all still live, I posted a lot around local because that was just, the area of passion that I had at that moment in time. So if you're a young person starting out, find what that passion is, and then look at the companies within that sector to make that happen. And, it's not just, the Googles and the Facebooks, and those are the companies that are like, oh, wow, they're, great brands and everybody wants to be product manager for them. They solve very interesting problems, but there's actually a lot of companies out there that are solving problems. So follow the passion in terms of what you like. I think second, work on your own personal brand and engage in those particular conversations. And then three, really surround yourself with people that you like and reach out. I mean, kind of like the way you did with me, Rhythm. You just reached out and we struck up a conversation, and here we go. A couple of months later, we're having this discussion. So, and be tenacious. I think if you're young, starting out, you're going to get a lot of no's. Don't let them bother you. As an entrepreneur, you're going to get lots of no's. As a product person, you're going to get lots of no's. Just keep hammering away. You're eventually going to get the yes.
Awesome. And there are few people like yourself that I've met during my journey. Are there any specific places or influences that you value and that you look forward to reading about?
Oh, that's a broad question. I love just information and knowledge in general. So I spend a lot of time reading different books from different industries. So I don't just read within the tech space. I think understanding what's happening just out of curiosity, within the transportation space, or understanding energy, and stuff that's happening on that front. And I think sometimes exposing your thinking to industries that you might not be working on today can give you some good insights that say, wait a minute, if that works over here, why wouldn't that necessarily work over here? So I do think just pure knowledge gathering it can never be a bad thing. If you're learning, it's never a bad thing. So that would be one piece of advice I would give. But there's lots of resources out there. I mean, the great thing is we live in a time where information literally is at our fingertips. And so if you want it, you can find it and you can get it. I think the biggest thing is just wanting it and carving out the time. So making the choice to carve out the time to learn.
For sure. Any particular people or influences that you follow?
Yeah, I've had great mentors over my career, and even on online. There's individuals that I follow, and candidly, and they vary. I would say there is, whether that happens to be, the Dalai Lama, who has very interesting insights into the way to look at the world, to political leaders, not from the perspective of necessarily their mandates, but in terms of how they communicate, in terms of the story to CEOs of companies. One of my mentors gave me one of the best pieces of advice that I would definitely I give to everybody, which is unless you're probably a surgeon or somebody within the medical world, don't take it too seriously, because if you mess up, likely somebody's not going to die. Now, if you're in an industry where literally if you do mess up, somebody's going to die, there's something there. And so that's been a great piece of advice. It's kind of always anchored my thinking, that has said, you know what, if we happen to be wrong in what we're trying to do, the worst case scenario, there's obviously impacts, but the worst case scenario, somebody's not going to probably die. That's actually a good thing. I don't know if I could actually ever be a surgeon and in the stuff that the medical community does. So God bless them for what they do. But I think that's been one piece of advice that's always carried through. That's kind of given me that lens that we're okay. If we make some mistakes, that's fine. That's how we're going to learn. That's how we're going to get better, and nobody's going to die on it. So I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. And I think someone also told me on similar lines that it's about the decisions that you make. Are they reversible or irreversible? Make more reversible decisions to learn more.
Absolutely. I think, Jeff Bezos has a good, and I use his quote many, many times, which is that notion of one-way doors and two-way doors. And so, managing the team when it comes to those one-way decisions. So we're about to make a big commitment on a capital investment or what have you. Obviously, we're going to slow things down and we're going to really make sure that we've done that. The rest of the time is very much, okay, I want the team to make those decisions. And as long as we put the right guardrails around that we can't, dramatically damage or take down the company, then I think for the most times it's actually good to let your teams just go through those doors and see how things shake out. But I like that analogy of the one-way and two-way door decisions.
All right, we do have a few more minutes left, so I think last couple of questions. One is a question from the audience. Sugandha is asking, what are some of the books that you would recommend for someone trying to get into product management and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, there's a lot of great books. A couple of great reads on, and this one's been pretty well documented, but what Google would do. There's a book, I think did Eric Schmidt write it. There's a couple of good books on Google, and I can send you over some of that stuff if you want to post it. And I think Google's a really interesting, fascinating study of an organization that went from really all the right timing. They really nailed it. But I think they are one of the ultimate product shops in terms of building out the products. So I think there's some great books on that side. Another great book that's actually been a big one for me is a book called Competing on Analytics. And this is really just a lot of use cases around companies, and Google's one of them that's in there. But Capital One, the football team, or Moneyball, was Oakland A's, is referenced in there on how they use data to have that competitive edge. Actually, RBC is even listed in that book in terms of how they use data from a competitive edge. So those are great ones. Then I like other ones like Ray Dalio's Principles, or a recent read that I had, just trying to think of the name, was the founder of Rakuten, and kind of talking about the principles of his organization, building a global organization out of Japan. And, his chapter on, you're a Japanese-based company and he's forcing the organization to operate in English because they're trying to do global expansion, which you can imagine that, being a Japanese-based company. There's so many that are out there. The last one that I just read was a book called Play Bigger, which is about designing and owning a category. And that's a fascinating read. A lot of it's anchored in the Salesforce story, which of course is a fascinating story and a fascinating company in terms of what they've done. But there's a lot. If you go to my personal blog, I do actually blog about some of the books that I read. I try to at least read a couple a month. So a lot of them are listed there. If you just Google my name and books, it'll pull up some of my blog posts.
Awesome. And yeah, like apart from that, I think two of my favorite books would be inspired by Marty Kagan, for someone trying to get into product management, trying to learn about what product management is. And on the entrepreneurship side, I really liked, as I mentioned earlier, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. It's a great book to read. It's a great framework to think about ideas and how to validate them. All right, Darby, last question. Who is your favorite entrepreneur and why?
Favorite entrepreneur and why? I'll use recent examples. I think somebody who's absolutely spectacular. I'll actually say two. One that I think is absolutely spectacular in terms of thinking massively big and putting the execution behind it is Elon Musk. I think this guy's an absolute true, the problems this guy is tackling is, huge. And everybody at the beginning is like, this isn't going to work. It isn't going to work. And so just to have that tenacity to think as bold as him, I think is quite spectacular. That being said, I don't think most people actually fall into that category. So there's really, really few individuals that are what I would call net new innovators. I think another CEO and leader that I really, really like at this point is actually Tim Cook. Tim kind of gets a lot of, well, he's not Steve Jobs and what have you. But he is as instrumental to creating Apple under when Steve Jobs was there, just with all the supply chain and really thinking about the business end of it. And when I think about somebody who has access to the amount of capital he has, I think he's got one of the toughest jobs right now, because he literally could do anything he wants. He's got the people, he's got the capital to do it. But that ability to narrow down choice and choose not to do 99.9% of the things and focus on this sliver of stuff that you can go really, really deep value on, I think he's just as impressive in a different way than say a person like Elon Musk. From a more Canadian perspective, I think the guys at Shopify have done a phenomenal job. I think Tobias, the story there of, hey, we just want to start. I just don't like the e-commerce platforms, and I want to build this out. And Harley, the COO, I've known these guys since Shopify started, and we started trying to do a deal with them at YP. I think they're an absolute amazing story in terms of just driving home and solving that one problem, and really anchoring around, let's just enable other people to be really, really successful. I think that's pretty admirable. So I could go on. I love watching successful people be successful.
Awesome. Well, we do resonate on Elon Musk's, the thing that he mentioned about the type of challenges that he's solving for, or the problems he's solving for. That makes one a great entrepreneur. But Darby, thank you so much for all these insights and answering all the questions we had this evening. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. Please help us spread the word for our Product AMA. You can follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter at Product AMA. And we love feedback. Give us topics or speakers that you want to see on Product AMA. And or for all the future updates from Product AMA, you can visit us on LinkedIn or Twitter for that as well. And Darby, thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. And everyone else, enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care, stay safe, and look forward to the next Product AMA.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for the invite.